For my book talk, I chose a 2017 National Book Award finalist, Never Caught, by Erica Armstrong Dunbar. This book also won the Frederick Douglass Prize. This is the story of a young woman who was a slave for the first 22 years of her life, owned by George Washington. She ran away and was never caught. The author is a black woman historian who writes about women's history. She was perusing newspapers from this era and saw an ad placed by the president for a runaway slave and wanted to write her story. I heard about this book and became interested in reading it when our class was reading Stamped. Ona Judge was a maid to Martha Washington. She ran away while George Washington was the president, living away from the slave state of Virginia and in the semi-free state of Pennsylvania. Before Martha married George, she had been married for 7 years and had 4 children. 2 of those survived, and those 2 moved to Mount Vernon with her when she married George Washington. Martha was much wealthier than George in both property and slave ownership, outward signs of wealth in Virginia at this time. Some of the slaves who moved with Martha were called dowager slaves, meaning their ownership stayed connected to descendants, not Mrs. Washington. This included any children or grandchildren a slave would have. The unforgettable part of this book for me is how devious Martha and George Washington were. When George was elected president, the nation's acting capital was in Pennsylvania. They moved to Philadelphia with 8 of their slaves, including Ona Judge. There was a law in Pennsylvania the Washingtons were unaware of until a friend warned them about it, Gradual Abolition Act of 1780. It allowed slaves to become free people after living there for 6 months. George and Martha devised a plan to move these slaves back to Mount Vernon every 6 months to stop the clock on their residency in Philadelphia. They traveled back and forth from Philadelphia to Virginia with the slaves for 5 years under the guise of tending to plantation business. George wrote in a letter, the scheme was meant to deceive the enslaved and the public. He didn't want the slaves to find out and run away, and he didn't want to call attention to his personal views on slavery. Another problem for them during the 8 years he was president and living in Philadelphia was keeping free blacks and abolitionists from passing information to the president's slaves. Someone must have befriended Ona Judge because her escape shows signs of having help from others. When she was 22 and walked away from the house, the Washingtons were having dinner. All she did was board a ship and went to New Hampshire, where she worked as a housekeeper. She was married and had 3 children. The title Never Caught gives the impression that this is going to have a happy ending, but it does not. While it's true Ona Judge was never caught, George Washington used his status to encourage people to try and find her, forcing her to stay a fugitive for the rest of her days. And I'll read an excerpt from it for you. Believing that Judge had been beguiled into running away, Washington asked Walcott to contact Portsmouth custom officer Joseph Whipple, which to his mind was a completely appropriate request, because that was his residency state in Philadelphia. Always cash-strapped, the president believed his suggestion for Judge's recovery would prove the safest and least expensive. For his troubles, Whipple would be compensated for any and all costs associated with the capture and return of his fugitive slave, and of course, the president would be thankful for his assistance. For many who served the young nation in any kind of authoritative role, the appreciation of the president was most welcome, for who wouldn't want to be in the good graces of the President of the United States? Ona Judge's husband died when the children were still young, and she had difficulty finding work and raising her children at the same time, and which left her destitute. Ona was one of the slaves owned by the estate, one of the dowager slaves, so she had to remain in hiding for the rest of her life or risk return to slavery, not only for herself now, but also her children. This would be an excellent book, I think, for the high school classroom. It's a great way for students to learn that there is more than just one side to history, and this book would certainly give a different perspective. Too often we put our founding fathers on pedestals, which can be misleading. I think this is also a lesson in how protecting personal wealth can lead to corruption. George Washington was not a great businessman, the author says, and Mount Vernon never did well. Losing Ona Judge meant he would have to pay the estate back, something he did not want to do. Overall, it reiterates the need to look beyond the textbook and see the broader scope. So that's my book talk on Never Caught.